Welcome back, friend. If you've been following this journey through America's forgotten places, you know by now that every abandoned town has layers. Stories within stories, dreams built and broken, communities that thrived and faded. These aren't just empty buildings. They're monuments to human ambition, perseverance, and the unstoppable tide of change. Tonight, we travel to 5 more ghost towns, each unique in its character and fate. From the foggy coasts of the Pacific Northwest to the sun-baked deserts of the Southwest. From company towns built by corporations to communities founded by hopeful settlers, these places once hummed with life. Today, they stand in silence, waiting for someone to remember, someone to tell their stories. So find your comfortable position, let your breathing slow, and prepare to journey through time and space. Let these tales of forgotten America carry you gently into rest. The ghosts are patient. They've been waiting a long time to share their stories with you. Part 1. Bannack, Montana, Montana's first territorial capital. In July 1862, a prospector named John White discovered gold on Grasshopper Creek in what would become southwestern Montana. Word spread like wildfire, and within a year, Bannack had materialized from nothing, sprawling across the Sagebrush Valley. By 1863, it was home to around 3,000 people, miners, merchants, families, gamblers, outlaws, and everyone in between. Bannack became the first territorial capital of Montana in 1864, a position it held for a single year before losing the honor to Virginia City. But for that brief moment, this rough mining camp was the political center of the Montana Territory, hosting lawmakers and territorial officials in buildings that were barely more than crude log structures. The gold was placer gold at first, loose flakes and nuggets in the creek gravels that could be extracted with pans and sluice boxes. This was the easiest kind of mining, requiring minimal equipment and expertise. A man with a pan and determination could make a living, or at least survive. It was this accessibility that drew so many people so quickly, the reign of the road agents. Bannack's early years were marked by extraordinary violence and lawlessness. The town became infamous as the headquarters of a gang of road agents, armed robbers who preyed on miners and travelers, led by Henry Plummer, who was simultaneously serving as the town sheriff. The gang terrorized the region for over a year. Plummer's dual role was a masterpiece of corruption. As sheriff, he knew when gold shipments were leaving, what routes they'd take, and who was carrying wealth. He could assign deputies to protect travelers, deputies who were actually fellow gang members ready to rob those same travelers once they were outside town. The system was ruthlessly efficient. The gang is believed to have killed more than 100 people during their reign of terror from 1862 to 1864. Bodies were found along mountain trails, in shallow graves, thrown into rivers. Some victims were shot, others hanged, some simply disappeared and were never found. The atmosphere in Bannack and surrounding camps was one of paranoia and fear. Finally, frustrated citizens formed a vigilance committee, essentially a vigilante organization operating outside legal authority. In January 1864, they executed Henry Plummer and 2 of his deputies in Bannack. Over the following weeks, vigilantes hunted down and hanged approximately 21 suspected gang members across the territory. The violence was sudden and brutal, but it effectively ended the road agents' reign of terror. A more civilized town. After the vigilantes cleaned out the criminal element, Bannack settled into a more stable, though still rough, existence. The Hotel Meade was built in 1875, providing comfortable accommodations. A proper courthouse replaced the crude territorial government buildings. Fraternal organizations, like the Masons, established lodges. Churches held regular services. A school educated children. The town evolved from a wild mining camp into something resembling a proper community. Families settled in. Women established social organizations that brought cultural events and attempted to civilize the rough edges. There were dances, theatrical performances, and holiday celebrations. Life became, if not easy, at least more predictable and safe. Gold production continued, but gradually declined as the easily accessible placer deposits were exhausted. Hard rock mining, tunneling into the mountains to reach gold-bearing quartz veins, required more capital and expertise. Several companies attempted large-scale operations with varying success. Some miners made fortunes. Many more made just enough to survive. Some lost everything. Slow fade. Bannack never experienced a sudden collapse. Instead, it declined gradually over decades. The population peaked in the early 1860s and drifted slowly downward. By 1900, only a few hundred people remained. The territorial capital had long since moved on. The richest gold deposits were exhausted. Younger residents left for opportunities in larger towns and cities. A devastating flood in 1907 damaged many buildings and convinced more people to leave. The post office closed in 1938, though a handful of residents remained. The last permanent resident left in the 1970s. By then, Bannack had been mostly empty for decades. Its buildings weathering slowly in the high mountain valley. Ghost town preserved. Today, Bannack is a Montana State Park and one of the best preserved ghost towns in America. Over 60 structures remain standing, including the Hotel Meade, Skinner Saloon, the Masonic Lodge, the old jail where Henry Plummer was supposedly held before his execution, numerous homes, and the schoolhouse. Visitors can walk the dirt streets, enter many buildings, and experience the ghost town atmosphere. The setting is beautiful, a wide valley surrounded by mountains, with Grasshopper Creek still flowing through. Sagebrush and grass have reclaimed much of the town site. The buildings stand like monuments to Montana's Gold Rush era. In summer, the park hosts Bannack Days, a living history event where volunteers, cute and period costume, recreate life in the 1860s and 1870s. Standing in Bannack on a quiet afternoon, you can almost hear the past, the stamp of horses' hooves, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer, voices calling to each other across the street, piano music drifting from a saloon. The ghosts here are particularly vivid, perhaps because so much remains of what they built and lived in. Part 2. Graphite, Colorado, the town that burned and froze. An unlikely resource. Most mining towns boomed because of precious metals, gold, silver, copper. Graphite. Colorado is unusual because it boomed because of graphite. This crystalline form of carbon might seem unglamorous compared to gold. But in the early 20th century, graphite was increasingly valuable for industrial applications, especially as a lubricant and in the emerging electrical industry. Graphite deposits were discovered in the area around 1899. The Colorado Graphite Company established mining operations, and a town quickly grew up to support the workers. By 1904, Graphite had around 300 residents, not large by mining town standards, but substantial for such a remote location. The town sat at 9,000 feet elevation in the Crystal River Valley, surrounded by the Elk Mountains of central Colorado. The scenery was spectacular: towering peaks, dense forests of aspen and pine, and crystal-clear mountain streams. It was also brutally isolated, accessible only by rough mountain roads that became impassable in winter. Life at altitude. Living in graphite meant adapting to extreme conditions. The altitude made everything harder: breathing, physical labor, even sleeping. Newcomers suffered headaches and shortness of breath until their bodies adjusted. The growing season was so short that fresh vegetables were a rare luxury. Almost everything had to be brought in by wagon during the brief summer and fall months. Winters were severe. Snow could begin in September and last until May or June. Accumulations of 10 to 15 feet were common. The town would be cut off from the outside world for months at a time. Supplies had to be stockpiled before the first major snows, and if you ran short, you simply did without until spring. Despite the hardships, people created community. There was a school for the children, a general store, a post office, and of course, a saloon. The company built boarding houses for single workers and small homes for families. On Saturday nights, there were dances in the community hall. In summer, children played in the creek and explored the endless forests surrounding the town. The work was hard and dangerous. Graphite mining involved tunneling into the mountain, blasting rock, and extracting the graphite bearing ore. Collapses, falls, and accidents with explosives were constant dangers. In winter, miners worked in darkness. They'd descend into the mines before dawn and emerge after sunset, going weeks without seeing the sun. Catastrophe and rebirth. In the early morning hours of December 9th, 1909, fire broke out in graphite. The exact cause was never determined, but fire spread rapidly through the wooden structures. 9,000 feet in December, with deep snow on the ground. Fighting the fire was nearly impossible. Most of the town burned. Remarkably, no one died in the fire, and the mine itself was undamaged. Within months, the company began rebuilding. New structures went up, more substantial this time, with some built of stone rather than wood. The town rose from the ashes, and operations resumed. For a few more years, graphite continued producing, but the rebuilt town never quite regained its former vitality. Graphite prices fluctuated, and competition from other sources cut into profits. World War I brought a brief boom as demand for graphite surged, but after the war ended, demand collapsed. By the early 1920s, mining operations had ceased. abandoned to the mountains. When the mines closed, people left quickly, like some ghost towns where a few residents lingered for years. Graphite was abandoned almost completely within a year or two. The elevation, isolation, and lack of economic alternatives made staying impossible. Families packed what they could carry and moved down to lower elevations, two towns with schools, stores, and opportunities. The post office closed in 1915. The school shut its doors. The store was boarded up. Within a few years, Graphite was empty except for the occasional prospector or hunter passing through. The buildings stood silent, slowly weathering under the assault of altitude, snow, wind, and time. Ruins in the wilderness. Today, Graphite is truly remote. The old wagon road is now a rough, four-wheeled drive trail, barely passable even in summer. The town site is on private property, though visible from the road. Foundations and partial walls of stone buildings still stand. Fragments of wooden structures protrude from the ground. Rusted mining equipment sits where it was abandoned. The forest has reclaimed much of the town site. Aspen trees grow up through collapsed buildings. Wildflowers bloom in summer where homes once stood. The surrounding peaks tower overhead, indifferent to the human drama that played out here a century ago. The silence is absolute. At 9,000 feet, even the air feels thin and quiet. In winter, when snow covers everything and temperatures plunge below zero, it's hard to imagine people lived here, raised children here, worked and hoped and struggled here. But they did, for a brief moment in history, before the fire and the cold and the economics of graphite mining drove them away. Part 3. Oyster, Virginia, the flooded island, an island community. Oyster, Virginia, was located on the eastern shore, on an island in the Chesapeake Bay. It was never a large town. At its peak, perhaps 200 to 300 residents, but it was a complete community with homes, a school, a church, stores, and a post office. The people made their living from the bay, harvesting oysters, crabs, and fish. Life on the island was shaped entirely by water. The bay surrounded everything. Transportation was by boat to the mainland, to other islands, to market. Children rode to school. Adults rode to work in their oyster beds. The rhythm of life followed the tides and the seasons of the bay's marine life. The island community dated back to the 1600s, among the oldest continuously inhabited places in English-speaking North America. Families had lived there for generations, their history intertwined with the island itself. People knew their neighbors intimately on a small island. Privacy was impossible, and community was everything. The oysterman's life. Oystering in the Chesapeake Bay was hard, cold work. Men would go out in small boats called dead rises or skipjacks, using long-handled tongs to pull oysters from the bay bottom. It was back-breaking labor, especially in winter when the water was frigid and the wind cut through any clothing. But the Chesapeake oysters were world famous, and when the harvest was good, oystermen could make a decent living. Oysters from the bay were shipped to Baltimore, Washington, New York, and beyond. During the season, the waters around Oyster Island were busy with boats working the beds. their crews calling to each other across the water. Women and children helped process the catch, shucking oysters in small processing houses, packing them for shipment. In summer, they'd crab and fish. Families grew small gardens, raised chickens, and made do with what the island provided. It was a hard life, but a satisfying one for those born to it, a life where you could feed your family from your own labor, where community was strong, where tradition ran deep. Rising waters. The Chesapeake Bay Islands have been eroding for centuries, losing land to rising sea levels and storm erosion. But in the 20th century, the process accelerated. Oyster Island began shrinking noticeably. Each major storm claimed more land. The shoreline retreated. Arches that had once been solid ground became open water. By the 1930s, it was clear the island was in trouble. Storms were getting worse, or perhaps the island was just lower and more vulnerable. High tides flooded areas that had previously been safe. Salt water invaded wells, making fresh water scarce. The oyster beds began declining too. Overharvesting and disease reduced the once abundant population. People began leaving, first a few families, then more. By the 1940s, the population had dwindled to a handful. The school closed in the 1930s when there weren't enough children to keep it open. The church held its last service. The post office closed. The island that had been home to generations was being abandoned to the bay. The final storm. In 1962, the Ash Wednesday storm, a powerful nor'easter, battered the mid-Atlantic coast. For 3 days, hurricane-force winds and massive waves pounded the Chesapeake Bay Islands. Oyster Island was devastated. Many of the remaining structures were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Most of the land was overwashed by storm surge. After the storm, the last residents left. There was simply nothing left to stay for. The island was mostly underwater at high tide. What structures remained were uninhabitable. The oyster beds were buried under storm-deposited sediment. The community that had endured for over 3 centuries came to an end in a single storm, lost to the bay. Today, Oyster Island is mostly gone. At low tide, you can see remnants, foundations, fragments of walls, pieces of machinery rusting in the marsh. A few pilings mark where docks once stood, but most of the island is simply open water now, claimed by the bay that once sustained the community. The story of Oyster is being repeated across the Chesapeake. Islands that once held thriving communities are shrinking or disappearing entirely. Tangier Island, Holland Island, James Island, all are losing the battle with rising water. In a century or less, many may be gone completely, existing only in memory and old photographs. Standing on the shore and looking out toward where Oyster Island once stood, you're confronted with a harsh reality. Some things can't be saved or preserved. Some ghost towns don't leave ruins you can visit and explore. They simply disappear, reclaimed by the very forces that once made them possible. The bay gives, and the bay takes away. Part 4. Animas Forks, Colorado, the Alpine Ghost. Mining at 11,200 feet. Animas Forks sits at 11,200 feet elevation in the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado, making it one of the highest towns ever established in the United States. The location is spectacular, a high alpine valley surrounded by towering peaks, the headwaters of the Animas River running through. Silver and gold were discovered in the area in the 1870s. Despite the extreme altitude and harsh conditions, prospectors swarmed in. By 1876, Animas Forks had been established, and by the early 1880s, it had grown to several hundred residents. Some sources say up to 450 people lived there during the boom years. Living at 11,200 feet is no small challenge. The air is thin, about 35% less oxygen than at sea level. Physical exertion becomes exhausting. Altitude sickness affects many newcomers. The growing season is essentially non-existent. Frost can occur any day of the year. Trees don't grow at that altitude, leaving the landscape barren and exposed. It's extreme winter. Winter at Animas Forks was legendary. Snow could begin in September and last until June. Accumulations of 20 to 30 feet were not uncommon, so the town would be completely buried, with residents digging tunnels through the snow to get from building to building. Avalanches were a constant threat, occasionally sweeping through and destroying structures. The cold was intense and unrelenting. Temperatures of 30 or 40 below zero were routine. Buildings had to be heated constantly, consuming enormous amounts of firewood and coal, all of which had to be hauled up from lower elevations at great expense. Frostbite was common. People lived bundled in layers of wool and fur. Despite these conditions, the community functioned year-round. The mines operated through the winter. Ironically, the tunnels underground were warmer than the surface. The general store remained open. A newspaper, the Animas Forks Pioneer, published regularly during the boom years. There was even a school teacher brave enough to spend winters at that altitude with the children. The residents developed unique adaptations. Buildings were constructed with steep roofs to shed snow. Doorways were built on second floors with exterior staircases because first-floor entrances would be buried all winter. Windows were small to minimize heat loss. Supplies were stockpiled in summer and fall to last through the long winter months. Brief glory. Animas Forks' boom was intense but brief. In the early 1880s, the mines produced well and the town thrived. There were several saloons, hotels, restaurants, and stores. A stamp mill processed ore. There was even a newspaper and a jail. For a few years, it seemed the town might endure despite the extreme conditions. The mines employed hundreds of men working multiple shifts. Ore was transported down to Silverton by wagon in summer and by sled in winter. The stamp mill ran constantly, its thundering noise echoing off the mountain peaks. Money flowed. Things were made. New buildings went up. It seemed the silver would last forever. But the silver didn't last forever. By the late 1880s, the richest deposits were depleted. The silver panic of 1893 crashed silver prices, making marginal operations unprofitable. Mines began closing. People began leaving. Some stayed on, working smaller operations or hoping for a revival. But the boom was clearly over. Abandonment. By 1910, only a handful of residents remained. The post office closed in 1915. The last year-round resident left in the 1920s, so some mining activity continued sporadically into the 1940s. But as a living community, Nemours Forks died around World War I. The extreme altitude and isolation meant that when people left, they left almost everything. Hauling possessions down the mountain was difficult and expensive. Many buildings were simply locked up and abandoned, contents inside. Over the decades, harsh weather, snow, and ice took their toll. Roofs collapsed, walls fell. The dry, cold climate also preserved what remained, Alpine Ghost Town. Today, Animas Forks is accessible by four-wheel drive vehicle in summer via the Alpine Loop, a spectacular, high-altitude, scenic route. Several structures still stand, including the famous Walsh House with its distinctive bay window, the Duncan Hotel, and various other buildings in various states of preservation and collapse. The setting is breathtaking, above timberline, surrounded by 13,000 and 14,000-foot peaks, with wildflowers blooming briefly in summer and snow never far away, even in July. The air is so clear and thin that the sky looks deeper blue than at lower elevations. The silence is profound, just wind, the sound of the river, and occasionally a marmot whistling from the rocks. Walking through Animas Forks, you're struck by the audacity of building a town here. The conditions that make it challenging to visit for a few hours in summer were year-round reality for the people who lived here. They endured months of darkness, cold, and snow, all for the chance to extract silver from these high mountains. It's both inspiring and slightly mad, a testament to human determination and the powerful lure of mineral wealth. Part 5. Drawbridge, California, Ghost Town on the Bay, a hunting paradise. Drawbridge, California, was unique among ghost towns. It was built entirely on pilings over the marshes of San Francisco Bay, located in the southern part of the bay. It was accessible only by railroad, with no roads connecting it to the mainland. The town was established around 1876 as a hunting and fishing resort. The marshes around Drawbridge were a paradise for waterfowl hunters. Millions of ducks, geese, and other birds used the bay as a stopover on their migration routes. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, wealthy San Franciscans would take the train down to Drawbridge on weekends to hunt, fish, and escape the city. At its peak, around 1910, Drawbridge had about 90 permanent residents and could accommodate several hundred visitors on busy weekends. There were hotels, boarding houses, saloons, stores, and dozens of small cabins built on stilts over the marsh. A narrow boardwalk connected the structures, and plank paths led out into the marshes to hunting blinds. Life on the water. Living in Drawbridge meant living literally on the water, or more accurately, on pilings driven into the marsh mud. The town rose and fell slightly with the tides. High tides would bring water lapping just below the floor joists. Low tides exposed mudflats that gave off a distinctive bay smell. The permanent residents made their living from the hunters and fishermen, running hotels and saloons, guiding hunting parties, renting boats and gear, cooking meals. It was seasonal work, busiest during the hunting season, in fall and winter, slower in summer. But there was enough year-round activity from railroad workers. There was a drawbridge for the trains. Hence the town's name and commercial fishermen to sustain a small community. Children grew up in this unusual environment. They rowed boats to get around. They fished off the porches of their homes, played in and around the marshes, learning to read the tides and navigate the maze of channels. It was a strange but wonderful childhood for those who lived it, a world of water, birds, and endless sky. Environmental changes. Drawbridge's decline began not from economic collapse, but from environmental changes, starting in the 1920s and accelerating in the 1930s. Salt production companies began buying up marshlands around the southern bay and converting them to salt evaporation ponds. This dramatically reduced the marsh habitat available for waterfowl. At the same time, agricultural runoff and sewage from surrounding communities began polluting the bay. The fish populations declined. The waterfowl populations dropped as their habitat was destroyed. Hunters found fewer birds. Fishermen caught fewer fish. The reason to visit Drawbridge was disappearing. A massive flood in 1936 damaged many structures and convinced some residents to leave. But the real death blow came from environmental degradation. By the 1940s, the once rich hunting grounds were severely depleted. The water quality was poor. The town that had thrived on nature's abundance was losing that abundance, slow sinking. The last residents left in the 1950s, though people visited occasionally into the 1970s. The structures were gradually abandoned to the elements and the bay. With no one to maintain them, buildings began to sag and collapse. The pilings rotted. Floors fell through. Roofs caved in. Making matters worse, the land was subsiding. Extensive groundwater pumping in the Santa Clara Valley caused the land to sink, and Drawbridge sank with it. High tides began flooding the structures. Salt water accelerated the decay. By the 1970s, most buildings had collapsed completely, lost to time and tide. Today, Drawbridge is completely inaccessible to the public. It's located within the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge, and access is prohibited to protect sensitive marsh habitat and for safety reasons. The remaining structures are unstable and dangerous. From a distance, you can see a few pilings still standing, fragments of buildings barely above the water. Most of the town is simply gone, collapsed into the marsh, reclaimed by the bay. Aerial photographs show ghostly outlines of where structures once stood, but at ground level, there's almost nothing left. The story of Drawbridge is a cautionary tale about environmental degradation. The town existed because of rich natural resources, fish and waterfowl. When humans destroyed those resources through pollution and habitat destruction, the town lost its reason to exist. Unlike mining towns that exhausted a finite resource, Drawbridge could have lasted indefinitely if humans had been better stewards of the bay's resources. Today, the area around Drawbridge is being restored as marsh habitat for wildlife. The salt ponds are gradually being converted back to tidal marsh. Birds are returning. It's a hopeful story of environmental recovery, but Drawbridge itself will never return. It's gone, swallowed by the bay, it once lived upon, a ghost town that left barely a trace. In closing, 5 more ghost towns, 5 more chapters in the endless story of human ambition meeting the forces of change. From Banax, gold, and violence, to graphites, fire, and ice. From oysters, rising waters, to animas, forks, alpine heights. From drawbridges, marsh, paradise lost, each place reminds us that nothing lasts forever, but the stories endure. What strikes me most about these places is the diversity of their deaths. Not all ghost towns died the same way. Some were exhausted, their resources depleted. Some were abandoned due to environmental catastrophe. Some simply became obsolete when technology changed, literally sank beneath the waves. The forces that created them and the forces that destroyed them were as varied as the human experience itself. But in every case, people tried. They built communities in impossible places, at 11,200 feet, where snow never fully melts, on islands slowly sinking into the bay, on pilings over the marsh. They adapted, persevered, created homes and lives in places that seemed to defy human habitation. And for a time, they succeeded. That success, however brief, is worth remembering. These ghost towns teach us about impermanence, yes, but also about resilience, about the human capacity to build something from nothing, to create community in the most unlikely places, to hope even when circumstances suggest hopelessness. The people who lived in these towns didn't know they were living in doomed places. They were just living their lives, doing their best, loving their families, and working toward a future they believed in. As you drift into sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of these places. You might stand in Bannack under the big Montana sky, or struggle through snow in the high mountains of Animas Forks, or row a boat through the marshes around Drawbridge when they were still full of birds and fish. You might feel the cold at 9,000 feet in Graphite, or sense the bay water rising slowly around Oyster Island. These places are gone or going, but they're not forgotten. As long as someone remembers, as long as someone tells the stories, these ghost towns live on. They whisper to us across the years, reminding us that we too are temporary, that everything we build will eventually return to dust and water and wind, but that the attempt to build something, to create something, to leave some mark, however small, that attempt is what makes us human. Rest well, and let the ghosts of these forgotten places watch over your dreams.